webinar series. This one's entitled Water Budgeting, the Future of Landscape Irrigation. My name's John Farner. I am the Government and Public Affairs Director for the Irrigation Association. Really appreciate everyone taking time out of the holiday season to join us for an hour today to talk about this pretty interesting issue. And judging by the amount of people that have registered and are signing on to this webinar, is obviously to us a pretty important concept and tool that, quite frankly, is going to be the future of landscape irrigation. So I'm going to go ahead and just give you a brief overview of the webinar, both kind of the logistics of the webinar as well as content, and then I'll throw it off to my colleague who's going to give the bulk of the presentation and, quite frankly, the more interesting component of the presentation. So just a little housekeeping before the webinar begins. This webinar is being recorded. Beginning next week, you'll be able to visit our YouTube page to visit the webinar series, this webinar, as well as all of our previous webinars that we've given. Irrigation.org/webinar_series is the way you can view this one and all of our past and future webinars that we have that are part of this series. Because of the amount of people that are attending these webinars, it gets pretty cumbersome if we were to open up phone lines for the question and answer period. So what we do is, if you have a question during the presentations, just go ahead and type that into the question box in your GoToWebinar toolbox, and I will go ahead and moderate a Q&A question and answer period after the presentation is concluded. And if you do hold an Irrigation Association certification, you do get a Tier 1 CEU credit for viewing this webinar. Just keep a record of your attendance. We already tracked your attendance in our database, but for your records, so go ahead and keep track of the date and time that you viewed the webinar. And that way, if you have any questions, you have any questions, you can just reference this webinar at a later date. So for those of you who are not knowledgeable about the Irrigation Association, we are a national trade association and the leading membership organization for water management companies and professionals in agriculture, landscape, and golf. This webinar really is geared towards the turf landscape side. However, I think we'll find out that water budgets can also be used on the agriculture side. So this is a pretty interesting topic throughout all facets of our industry. To briefly go through our strategic plan and where this webinar and topic fit in, we have a simple mission: to promote efficient irrigation, and we try to use those words in whatever we do, whatever concepts we talk about, whatever initiatives we undertake. We have the core focus of making sure that the water is used through irrigation is done so as efficiently as possible. And looking at our core strategic initiatives, this concept that we're talking about in this webinar really encompasses all of these. Brent's going to go through water budgeting as part of the standards and codes process. We're talking about this in the public affairs realm. It's going to be used in our education and training purposes as well. So really, this topic encompasses all parts of our core strategic initiatives of the Irrigation Association. And then, of course, we have our support initiatives that are the Irrigation Show and our membership functions. So let's talk a little bit about this issue and why we're talking about it. I pulled up some headlines that I pulled off of the internet this morning, to be honest with you. So the first one, brown is the new green, from Dig magazine. This was written on December 9th. Effects of the drought in Long Beach. Now, these are going to be pretty California focused because of what California is facing right now in their drought period. But this brown is the new green is really a trendy words to use when talking about water use in the landscape and what to do with the landscape plant material that needs the water to survive. Turf removal rebates. We're seeing that throughout the West primarily, in the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, Santa Barbara Water Authority. Turf removals is controversial throughout our industry. It seems to work, otherwise water providers would not be doing it. However, is it the right answer? Are water budgets a better answer? Can we use a water budget instead of these turf removal projects? These are questions that we are, as an industry and association, are looking at on a daily basis. Behavioral shift, water usage behavior. How do homeowners, consumers, property management professionals use water. What is their behavior? Are we still using a standard clock and calendar system to just turn on a zone for 20 minutes twice a week? And that's that regardless of what the landscape needs and regardless of how much water is being used. Just don't know. Right? So the behavioral changes is another component of the water budgets that we are really looking at tying into the overall usage, public policy debates, and acceptance of this concept. So why are we looking at this right now? So this is the most recent U.S. drought monitor of the continuous United States, and this was dated December 9th, 2014, 2 days ago. This map itself was actually released this morning, so it's pretty up to date. It came out at 7 o'clock a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and you'll see the majority of California is still under drought 4, the 4th level of drought, which is exceptional drought. We are seeing some rain, continued rain in California, some snowpack coming in the northern part of the state. So hopefully this will help manage some of the drought that's out there. But we need to look at how we manage our water moving forward, whether California is in a drought, whether the rest of the United States is in a drought or not in a drought. So let's look at where we were 2 years ago this week. California was looking all right. You know, you had some stage 1, stage 2 areas in California, but this is kind of normal of what California is seeing. So the behavior that California is under, excuse me, really drives the water usage year to year. But let's look at the central part of the United States, really coming straight over the Ogallala Aquifer, straight down the 100th meridian, from Nebraska down through Kansas, Oklahoma, into Texas, into South Dakota, and even into states like Iowa. This is the 2012 drought, at the beginning stages of the 2012 drought, where really decimated a lot of our crops in America's heartland. So what we see from 2012 to where we are now is completely different. So the behaviors of where we were in 2012 in these states need to be different, need to change. Whereas in 2014, where we are now, hopefully a lot of these concepts that they've learned in 2012 are still being employed today, even though that drought does not exist. So let's look further back in 2011, completely different scenario. Now we're looking at a state like Georgia, Louisiana, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama, and Florida's Panhandle under severe drought, as well as New Mexico, the majority of Texas, and parts of Arizona. Now this is coming into the eastern part of the United States, parts where we are used to having a lot of rain, and when we have rain with a lot of it, and we have drought, it's pretty severe. So really, this is showing us that our droughts are becoming worse, and our periods of rain are becoming more extreme. So the extremes are becoming more extreme, and there's not much in the middle. So the concepts of long-lasting ways of doing things, ways to manage your water, ways to manage your irrigation system is really what we're looking at employing both from on a behavioral perspective, but promoting it through incentives and good public policy as well. And that's where we are right now, and I'm really excited to have Brent Mecham, who's my friend and colleague here at the Irrigation Association, give a presentation about water budgets. Brent has been with the Irrigation Association coming up on 8 years. I've been here just a year less than that, coming up on 6.5 or so years. And from the time where I started to work for the Irrigation Association, the concept of water budgets was just coming to the forefront, where we had a national debate about the use of turf grass and the use of water budgets, where they fit in. So this is a concept, while quote-unquote new, has been part of what we're doing at the Irrigation Association for quite some time. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this over to Brent right now. And Brent, thank you very much. The floor is all yours.
All right. Thank you very much, John. And I'll bring up my PowerPoint presentation here so that it's full screen, and hopefully you can confirm that and tell me so. Okay.
You look good on there, Brent. Thanks.
Well, you know, if it's camera's far enough away, I do look okay. So anyway, I appreciate all those who have come to attend this webinar today, and hopefully I can give you some information and some ideas that will help you in what you are doing and how you are related to the landscape and the irrigation industry. And so the topic, as John has mentioned, is about landscape water budgeting. I want to talk a little bit about some of the market forces that are in play right now. And one of them is the idea of we need to become more sustainable. And so there are a lot of green initiatives. Most of them have a focus on how to reduce water use, and there's usually a component about the outdoor water use as well as indoor. And so that's a big player and changing how we do things in the market. And the other aspect is that, well, if you're going to reduce that outdoor water use, maybe we should be doing more native or natural type landscapes where there's no irrigation required. And that sometimes gives me a little bit of heartburn because I've made my career around landscaping and irrigation, and somebody to tell me I'm not necessary anymore sometimes gets me a little bit irritated. And if I live in a high rainfall area, I probably do agree that we could probably figure out how to do this without irrigation. But I'm from Colorado and the arid West, and irrigation is really essential in order to maintain and have a viable landscape that enhances the community. And as John has already mentioned, the other big market force is drought. It depends on the severity and the longevity. Landscapes are large water users, and they are a lower priority for compared to life, health, and safety. And so a lot of times there are watering restrictions put into place that the water providers are more or less forced into doing because they're trying to manage a limited source and cover a lot of needs. And we get that. And sometimes there are ways to manage a landscape to be part of that solution. And hopefully today this water budgeting will provide some of that information. There's a lot of perceptions that, quite frankly, almost become reality. One of them is that half the water is wasted with irrigation. And I would agree that there are probably sites where way too much water is being used. But I also travel around quite a bit, and I see places where it looks like they're doing a good job or maybe not even using enough. And a lot of those places that tend to be underwatering have been those who have experienced severe droughts in the recent past. We always get this thing that hand watering is more efficient. And there are probably data out there that would support that, but part of it is less water maybe used going through the meter, but is it been really effective? Are the plants doing as well? And quite frankly, a lot of people don't have time to do hand watering. That's why they do get irrigation systems, and it becomes very labor intensive. And that the original green industry isn't so green, and I get that kind of all the time. So today what I'm hoping to do is to say, here's a tool that can make us look like we are truly professional, that we are green, we are good water stewards, we do care about what goes on. We have to improve in a measurable way that we're part of the solution and not the problem. And so I think that's a real challenge. I walk around feeling like this most of the time, that there's a target on my back because I do represent the landscape and irrigation industry. And past behavior and past performance sometimes merits the fact that that target is there. But I would like to say that target can also be an opportunity for us to hone in and get the bullseye on how to do things better. The Irrigation Association has a position statement, and I would like to read it to you, even though you can read it right on the screen as well. But it basically is saying, as stewards of water resources, irrigation industry professionals rely on many tools available to efficiently irrigate a landscape. Determining the volume of irrigation water required to maintain a healthy, functional landscape that provides numerous environmental, ecological, and cultural benefits is essential when developing an accurate irrigation schedule. Whoops. Water budgets provide an analytical framework for determining the minimum amount of applied water required to produce the social, economic, and environmental benefits of an irrigated landscape. Determining the correct inputs to a water budget is a critical step in creating meaningful and effective water budgets. Input to the water budget must be tailored to the local conditions and based on sound science. The IA supports the use of water budget methods along with measurement of the applied water based on local and regional scientific data. And that statement was approved by our board of directors in 2010, so 4 years ago. But it's an important part of what we perceive as a way to promote efficient irrigation. So why water budgeting? For me, it's really a best management practice. That's why we should be doing it. It's because it's the right thing to be doing, and if we do it correctly, we will be able to document and prove that we're good stewards of water. Water budgeting is a way for me as a professional to demonstrate and document my water stewardship. It's a water management tool. It measures scheduling effectiveness, and it's now being used to influence landscape designs. And lastly, I'm beginning to see ways to use it whereby we can balance the water availability with demand. So many of the green initiatives are looking to say, let's don't use potable water for irrigation. Let's find other sources. And frequently, a lot of those sources can be generated on site. And once we can figure out how to quantify the water that can be generated and harvested on site, that will actually begin to determine what will the landscape composition look like. And so that will be a way to be a more sustainable type of project. So water budgeting is documented in our best management practices. This is available to anybody. It's a downloadable document from irrigation.org and /landscape BMPs, or if you go to our website and go to the navigation bar that says standards, it's readily available there. But we actually talk about water budgeting in two places. One is in the practice guidelines for irrigation design, that it can be used to help influence what the design of the irrigation system is to match what the design of the landscape will be. And then the other part and more detailed explanation is in the appendix, but it's an integral part of irrigation management. So those are spelled out in our BMPs and our practice guidelines. We encourage anybody to download that, read it over, and we have had numerous large corporations who have asked permission to incorporate that into their standard operating procedures when they're dealing with their large landscapes. So I want to talk a little bit about water stewardship. And I would like to thank the internet for having all kinds of attractive photos on landscapes that I could grab today and just put into my PowerPoint. But water stewardship is learning to use water efficiently and effectively. And one of the real challenges we have is that every landscape is unique. And so you have to have a lot of skill and understanding of the plants and the soils and the irrigation system to figure out how to do this most efficiently. We need to try to match the demand to the available supply. And so you begin to see all kinds of more natural-looking landscapes coming into play, but they still require water. We just need to know how to put on the correct amount of water to keep them viable and healthy. And the other part of this is to understand the purpose and the function of what that landscape is. And then we can begin to match the resources and the inputs in order to get the desired results that we need from the landscape. So this one's beautiful. You know, love it to be my backyard, except for the day I have to mow it. Water budgeting, I think, is a very effective management tool. And part of the reason for using it is it helps verify that the irrigation schedule is working correctly. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And a lot depends on where you live and why there might be a water budget in place. So some water budgets are flexible, and that means that they are changing with the weather, that if it's hotter, more water is available. If it's colder or it's raining, you would need less water. And so that water budget frequently, when that's flexible like that, dependent on the weather, is really calculated on a monthly basis or as often as the billing cycle comes around. More often, though, we are beginning to see a fixed water budget, which is really an allotment or allowance of water that does not respond to the changing weather, but it is based on historical ET or evapotranspiration. It's really looking at what has been the historical demand for water by the plants in that area and using that to begin to figure out an allowance. And which way works best? I'd say it really depends upon the water agency, the water portfolio, and the existing laws that are in place, whether a flexible or a fixed allotment or allowance, meets the needs. but I think we can work with both of them. I have worked with both of them. The next step I look at, I like to call it scheduling effectiveness. And to me, this is very important. Are the plants healthy and viable? And does the landscape, is it functional for its purpose? Okay, so if I had my grandchildren running around on this, I would hope it to be green and not be, turning brown or looking like there was never any grass there. So to me, this is a much more functional, and it meets the purpose. And so, yes, that would be an important use of water. But this is one of my favorite pictures. I can make sermons out of this particular picture. And is it efficient? Yes, it is. Is it effective? No, it's not. And that's one of the cons about looking at efficiency and not considering effectiveness. So if I am underwatering the landscape compared to what it might need, I could be highly efficient. In fact, my efficiency can exceed 100%. But if it's not an effective use of water, how efficient is that really? And so sometimes we need to look at what's that purpose and function of the landscape. So if I am trying to sell lawn circles, then this would be an extremely good representation of what's possible. But if I want somebody to go out there with, or their kids, and to play on it without hurting themselves or to have a good experience, it probably isn't a very good use of the water. It's a lack of water, and so we can actually create some additional problems. But this is a soccer field that's in a park area, and great picture. The last place that I would like to talk about is, how does water budgeting influence design? And specifically, I'm going to talk about landscape design, because if there's a limited amount of water or an allowance is determined, then the landscape designer or architect has to begin to figure out, well, what kind of plants will I use? How much turf grass area might I need? Will it all be useful and purposeful? And then try to be able to balance that. So some of the more well-known water budgeting tools that are out there is the California Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, AB 1881, December 2010, so about 4 years ago. We will look at that one a little more in depth because I think it's a really good one. Another one that has been created for the last 4 years or so is the EPA WaterSense water budget tool. And there they've actually taken this concept of water budgeting and have dictated an adjustment factor for the ET and said this is how effective rainfall and stuff will be, and really looked at the peak demand month. When do you have the highest demand for water and the least amount of rainfall, and said based upon that peak demand month, this is the water that would be available, and that's going to influence the selection of plants and turf grasses that would be used. And now we have more recently LEED version 4, or the Sustainable Sites 2.0 version, which basically is now using the EPA WaterSense water budget tool, only they have some additional requirements in there. If you want to get points, you're going to reduce that adjustment factor from 0.7 to 0.5 or even more in order to really reduce the outdoor water demand. So I just thought I'd throw in some pictures because I think it illustrates how budgeting can influence design. So this is a great photo of a sports field, and looks like it's plenty big and looks like a great place to play. And then I look at this photo, which I found, and suddenly I say, okay, maybe they just don't have a lot of water, so they can't have anything more than just a plain surface being irrigated. And then there are surrounds where I guess the team would be standing and stuff like that. But that would be an example of how budgeting can influence the design. It's not that that would be ideal, but that's the water availability, and so trying to make a good plain surface, that was the choice. I look at this one, and so here's a residential property, and it's got some lawn, but it's got a lot of landscape area and trees, and so it still demands water, just water in a different way than what you do the turf grass, and I compare that to a different environment, very typical of what you see in the arid Southwest, where yes, there is some grass, but then you see an awful lot of rock mulch and sparsely planted plants, and that's really kind of responding to available water. This is what we're able to do, and so that dictates a look and a style of a landscape. And most of the time, these are regionally adjusted and adopted and accepted. And so we can learn to work with that. Nonetheless, we still need to be responsible for how much water. And the last place, which I've touched on a little bit, is water budgeting is now becoming a tool whereby we can balance on-site harvested water to potential landscape water need. And this is starting to look at all the water sources available, whether it's rainwater harvesting, it might be air conditioning condensate that's captured, it could be gray water. There's all these available sources of water which we could try and calculate, its reliability and do that on a monthly basis, and then figure out, well, how much storage would I need, and then what kind of a landscape or planted area would I have. I think this is going to become even more important as we begin to have some synergy between what landscapes are like and what stormwater management goals are, the low impact development or the green infrastructure. They all need to work together because long term, their goal is let's keep all this stormwater on site. And if you're going to keep it on site, you have to have a way to use it. And it can either percolate into the ground, which is great for, groundwater recharge, or it can be evaporated or transpirated via plants. Somehow you have to be able to manage that water on site, and that takes a lot of pressure off of the stormwater systems, the sewage systems, and even the impacts on river systems. So I was going to just take a few minutes and go through some of the numbers here. People often ask, okay, how do I calculate a water budget? What I'm going to show you first is what is within our best management practices document. So that was a document created by the Irrigation Association in collaboration with the American Society of Irrigation Consultants. These are the real experts on figuring out how to use water and understand irrigation management. So with that, we're looking at a landscape water allowance, LWA. And I know everybody hates acronyms, and I seem to be the king of acronyms in my current role, but trying to simplify the communication. And so we'll look at that. How much water is going to be allowed to be used? We're going to look at the reference ET data, which hopefully, is going to be more readily available today than it was 10 years ago. California, they have a great weather station system up and down the state. You go to Oklahoma, they likewise have a good one. Colorado has a good one in the more populous parts of the state. And Florida, Georgia, so more and more states are relying on that because it's not only used for landscaping, but primarily is used for agricultural water usage. And then you have the adjustment factor, meaning what percentage of that reference ET are we going to allow for the landscape? Most of the time you're going to find that adjustment factor is between 0.6 to 0.8. 0.8 generally happens in areas which has a fairly high rainfall area and there's plenty of water available. The 0.6, or sometimes even lower, would be found in places that are water challenged, in the desert areas and things like that. So whatever seems to be appropriate for the climate that you live in. The landscape area is really how many square feet are you trying to manage and maintain with irrigation. And the 0.623 is a conversion factor. It takes all those units and gets it into gallons, because ultimately we're looking at how many gallons is available for a period of time. And this water budget can be done on a monthly basis. It could be done annually, or it can even be done for every individual irrigation event. If I've had 2 days since I last irrigated, I could figure out a water budget based on current ET and be able to create a schedule to put on that amount of water. I'm also going to add in that there's an optional thing that we need to remember and consider, and that is that sometimes if you're in an area that has poor water quality, high salts or whatever that's detrimental to plants, it actually takes more water, and so we call it a leaching factor or fraction. It might be 20%, it could be 25% more water than ideal, but you need that in order to move solids and things that are in the water that's detrimental to plants to push it out of the root zone. But I'm not going to complicate it with what we're doing today, but other to mention that that's an important and a beneficial use of water if it's poor water quality, that you might actually need more. Then the other side of this water budgeting is, well, what's the water requirement? So we look at the allowance, and now we go and look at our landscape and say, how much does my landscape require? And kind of goes through the same thing. So LWR, the landscape water requirement, in gallons is going to be based upon the reference ET times a plant factor, and then we can subtract out any effective rainfall. So if I'm living out here in Virginia in the east, there's a fair amount of effective rainfall, so we would subtract that because Mother Nature's met most of the need, and then I'm just needing to supplement with the irrigation. And again, looking at the landscape area, the conversion factor to get it into gallons. And then a really important part is the irrigation efficiency. And I'm going to see if I can do something here of highlighting this number. That irrigation efficiency, and if you look down at the bottom, I have shown it, is to say that if you don't have a great irrigation system, you actually take more water because you are trying to accommodate for the fact that it's not been distributed evenly over all the area. And without a long discussion about that, you know, if it's 90% efficient, which we can probably say we can get that with drip irrigation, it takes 10 or 11% more water than ideal. On the other hand, if we had an irrigation efficiency of about 70, which sounds pretty good, that takes really 42% more water. So it becomes really a multiplying factor at irrigation efficiency, and it's a very important part of estimating water requirement and making sure how it will compare to our water allowance. All right, now that I did that, well, that was, oh, there we go, here we go. Okay, now, in the end, what we're striving to do is to see if our water requirement is less than our water allowance. And if it is, we are now doing a great job. And this can be figured out on a monthly basis or for the billing period, or it could be done annually. Somehow, it's a way to start accounting for the use of water. However, if the water requirement exceeds the water allowance, then management decisions need to be made. We need to start looking into it is why. You know, do I have all the right parameters for my schedule? Do I have too many minutes runtime? How did I come up with that I'm applying more water than I need? Which leads me to a very important message. Water budgeting, while it's very useful, for me, it's not very meaningful unless I'm willing to measure the water so I can make management decisions. Many irrigation systems, especially residential, they do not have a dedicated water meter. But water meters, simple ones, are fairly affordable, and if I'm doing this, it may be worth investing $100 so I can really know how much water am I using. If it's a really large system, you know, obviously the meter is going to cost more. But if you are not measuring, it makes it really hard to make a good management decision. I've even figured out, well, if I don't have a way to measure with a water meter, an alternative is actually to use a rain gauge, only we'll call it an irrigation gauge. And I've used all of these. And so it's an opportunity to go and say, I have an irrigation event scheduled tonight. I think I'm going to put on a ½ inch of water, at least that's what I calculated, and then to put out a bunch of rain gauges in the irrigated area, let it run its cycle, and then come back and measure how much water really got applied. And that will begin to tell you how effective is your scheduling methods. You know, and then you still need to look at the landscape. But knowing how much, and I have done this when numerous times when I worked for a water agency in Colorado. I actually worked with 7 golf courses and put these rain gauges like you see on the left-hand side actually out in the fairway. They were recessed. They're usually about 25 yards in front of the ladies' tee box. Seldom did anybody ever walk there. I only found 1 golf ball in 7 years of doing this. But it became very effective, and it was a way for me to communicate with the superintendent how much water were they using. I never told them how to do scheduling. I only reported the water that they were using, and it was amazing that they made the adjustments on their own, and they got to be extremely good at this. And we provided a record for them, so it was something that they could go back and look at, and that became very valuable to one of the property managers that we did this for a large corporation later on. The statement I want to make: if water applied exceeds the estimated need, here's your opportunity to make adjustments to the schedule. Or if you got a smart controller, it's a way to go and look at the inputs to make sure that they're correct for the site. Again, if you're not measuring, you can't manage. So either with water meter records or using rain gauges, it's in a very effective way. The rain gauges work great on a irrigation cycle by irrigation cycle or event. A water meter is a good way to document water usage over a longer period of time. Now, water budgeting has several approaches, and we've talked a little bit about it, but one of them is the water allowance or allotment or allocation, however you'd like to say it. It's a proportional amount of water that can be assigned to the user. The flexible water budget then also has the ability to respond to real-time fluctuations in weather conditions, or ET. And the fixed one is going to be fixed. It really won't matter what the weather's doing, but it is based on historical weather data. And it's usually accompanied by tiered water rates. I'm going to go through one of the more popular, and maybe the first agency to really do this was the Irvine Ranch Water District. And they have massaged it over the years, but they have been doing this probably at least 15 years, if not longer. And they've made an outdoor allocation, and this is based upon their 2014 information that I got off their website. So their outdoor allocation, or as we were calling it, a landscape water allowance, is based upon the landscape area and the reference ET. They allow a KC, or a plant factor, or turf coefficient, which they are using as 0.65 because in their jurisdiction, warm season turf can be used. And they make the assumption of an irrigation efficiency of 71%. But they put it in here as 1.4, and 1.4 just really represents 1 divided by 71%. And I agree with the fact that most of us like to multiply and not ever divide. And then the 36.3 is a conversion factor to get all of these units together so that it matches their billing units of 100 cubic feet. The allocation, their way theirs works is that it changes with the weather throughout the year. So you get a monthly bill, and they will show you what the ET was and what your allocation was in the next month. And so from year to year, July to July can be very different because of what's going on with the weather. This is how it works with their tiered rate structure. And I did this where they typically price their water with 100 cubic feet, the CCF. And I changed that over to what it is for 1,000 gallons for many of us who like to work in those kind of units. But they have a low volume, then they have the base rate, and then they call it inefficient, excessive, or wasteful user. What you really need to know is, well, what is the tiers there? So the base rate, you get up to 100%, and you have this very affordable water rate. And if you're inefficient, meaning that you're using 10% more than what you should be, you will notice that you're paying substantially more money. It's more than twice as much. If you're excessive, meaning that you're using 20% more water than you should have been using, you start to pay an increased amount of money for that extra water that you're taking. And at 21% or higher, you're going to be in the wasteful category. And there you can see it's a very hefty amount of water or money for the water that you're taking. So that's how Irvine has done it. They've pioneered this concept. They've fine-tuned it and tweaked it over the years. And their budget calculation, I think, is where it works out to be pretty fair. And I think they have really good documentation that customers like it, and it's been very positive feedback for them. Another one that's a very different approach to water budgeting is in Boulder, Colorado, which has an opportunity. They have kind of a problem in that they have plenty of water resources available to them, but they are challenged by being able to get those water sources to their city. So that's one of the things that in Colorado, you may have water rights that are up in the mountains, but actually getting it to where you need it is challenging. They also are growing, but their water supply isn't necessarily growing. So they set their outdoor allowances in a much different way. They looked at what the irrigable area was, including the right-of-way that the property owner might be responsible to take care of. They used historical ET, as can be shown in this chart. And then their budget was basically for the first 5,000 square feet of landscape area, you get 15 gallons per square foot. The next 9,000 square feet, you get incrementally a little bit less. And if you go over 14,000 square feet, you get less water. And this is based on people who have, you know, this is residential. Obviously, they only have 1 meter, and it has to cover indoor and outdoor. And if there's an irrigation-only meter, such as a park or a industrial complex or something that just meters the water independently, the allowance is fixed at 15 gallons per square foot. Now, people ask, why do they use 15 gallons per square foot? In some ways, it's very easy for a homeowner to go out and measure. He's got 5,000 square feet and a 15 gallons per square foot. He gets 75,000 gallons of water to take care of that landscape for the year. And the way they divvy it up is every month you get a portion of your allotment. So you can see in the month of June and July, you get 20% of the total for each of those months. If you took 25%, you actually will pay more money because you're only allotted this. And so they're trying to meter out the water to last the season, but this is how they came up with it. And that pretty much matches the historical ET curve. However, if it's much hotter in July than what this says, there is no extra water to compensate for the extra temperature and the higher ET. So a customer that had a 15,500 square foot of irrigated area, this is how it kind of divides up. You can see each increment gets a little bit less water. The total outdoor allocation for the year is just under 200,000 gallons. They also have a tiered rate structure, and so they look at it, and the base rate, block 2, you know, is 100%. But if you get into block 3, you're going to pay twice as much for the water as the base rate. But you can go up to 50%, you know, and compare that to Irvine, you know, the next block was 10% increments. So this fits the city of Boulder. It works. There was a lot of heartburn initially with landscapers trying to work this out, but it has worked for them, and it was a water management tool for them as a city, and it also becomes a water management tool for the landscape manager. Now I'm going to refer to the California Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance. Again, it's an equation. They all do about the same thing. They use different acronyms. California, you will often hear them talk about the MWELO, or the Maximum Applied Water Allowance. Based again on ET, the 0.62 is the adjustment factor, which looks very similar to the 0.623 that IA uses in our document. So you see that frequently. They have a unique way, and I truly appreciate how they've tried to do this, is that not all landscapes are created equal. So for the basic landscape, you get 0.7 as an adjustment factor. But if you have some special landscape areas, let's say it's a sports field or a park, or for whatever reason it needs more water, then they actually give you more water up to full ET for the special landscape areas. And so all of that goes into their, you know, water allowance, and they've taken that all into account. So they kind of looking at it not only for their own whole site, but at least your typical landscape areas, special landscape areas, in order to make a what I would consider a pretty fair approach to figuring out the allowance. They also have a little consideration. If there's effective rainfall, you can use 25% of that amount and subtract it from the ET, which will give you a smaller allowance. But probably this past year or two, they haven't really had a very much effective rainfall. Then there's estimating how much water is used. Okay, so again, it's based upon ET, the conversion factor to get it to gallons. They do it on a hydrozone basis. So a plant factor, which they get from what they call their WOLCOS list, which is a water use classification of landscape species. So if you know what the hydrozone area is, and you go and look at what's the plant factor for the kind of plants that are there, again, divided by irrigation efficiency, which they say it has to be at least 71%. It can be higher. All of that goes into their calculation for figuring out how much water did your landscape require. My bottom line message is this. Water budgeting should be practiced voluntarily as a professional and as a good steward of water resources. Where water budgeting exists, you need to figure out how to comply. But I see it as an opportunity to work with the property owners because they may not be fully aware, and there may be some challenges that the kind of landscape intended versus what's available for water are not very compatible, and so changes will need to be made. You need to calculate the schedules and or verify your controller inputs. So that's one way that this water budgeting says, I think I'm putting on 5,000 gallons today, and then I go and read the meter and I put on 8,000 gallons. That should send a signal to me that I need to make an adjustment. Why is it so much more than what I thought? Is it because there's errors in the scheduling or the programming of the controller? And then because I make those measure that water usage, I am now informed and empowered to make a good management decision. And ultimately, I want to say document, document, document. We don't like to do a lot of paperwork, but this is one case where I think it behooves us to show that we are responsible for the amount of water we're using. That if we get called on the carpet, so to speak, we can say, this is the amount of water that was supposed to be used, this is how much I used, and you put yourself in a very defensible position because you have information. So I will share a story. My friend Paul, who is a property manager for a large company in Colorado, they essentially had direct river water rights, so they pulled water directly out of the river, and yet his corporate responsibility, the big boys who came from out east, came into town and said, you're overwatering, and we know it. And he wanted to know, well, how is it that you know that I'm overwatering? And their response was, which we typically hear, if you have an irrigation system and you're irrigating, we know you're wasting water. And so in front of him, the big board that he was talking to, he said, I have records. And he pulled out these records that we have been giving him for 7 years, just monitoring with rain gauges, the amount of water being applied to the landscape compared to what the reference ET adjusted for the grass and stuff would have been. And he was able to lay it down, and he had gotten extremely good with very antique equipment at managing the water. And he said, well, here's my proof that I'm not overwatering. Now, where's your proof? And he walked out of that office that day feeling really good, and in fact, he got a promotion out of it because of how well he was prepared as a professional grounds manager to document what he was doing. So I think that was a simple illustration of why we as professionals need to take that responsibility on ourselves voluntarily. I know it's really challenging because people really aren't paying us to be good water managers yet. On the other hand, I think we need to be able to document and prove that. Companies that have had opportunities to document their water usage, it actually shows up on water use records that a utility might have, frequently have the documentation they need to go in and plead for mercy or an exemption from restrictions. And this is a very important part because places that suddenly are challenged by water and they say, we need you to reduce water by 20%. And if I'm somebody that's been doing a really good job of water management all along, 20% is going to take a severe toll on what my landscape may look like. On the other hand, if I'm somebody that's been overwatering by 100% and somebody says reduce by 20%, great, I can overwater by 75% and I'm a hero. So I think those are the opportunities that are available to us, is to really show why this practice of water budgeting is really good. And so I would like to encourage people to do that. So John, I thought I would stop here for a few minutes and we could do some question and answers. And if there are no questions, then I don't have to provide answers. I actually have a couple examples I've worked out if people are interested, but I'd rather answer questions at this point in time.
There are definitely questions, Brent. Let me, and by the way, thank you very much for that. It was very good. And let me just go back to my screen here. Let's see here. There we go. So, a few questions. First one, and I'm going to paraphrase some of these questions because we had a few that were fairly similar, but the examples you showed were great, and it seems that a lot of decisions that, however, it's not being employed by a lot of water providers in a lot of areas because the customers are not demanding it. So, what would you say is the kind of the, if not a silver bullet, some answers or some suggestions on how to drive the necessity or the implementation of these water budgets at the customer level?
So I think that a lot depends on perhaps what the corporate philosophy of the customer might be. Some customers, you know, they're only looking at the lowest cost, bottom line, you know, just make it green and clean and don't bother me. Those kind of customers are going to be very difficult to convince that they ought to spend a little more money so you can be a responsible steward. On the other hand, if you find a customer, and they tend to be larger corporations, quite frankly, who get this idea that sustainability is good for their bottom line, those are the ones that can be interested. And if you can show, and this takes a little bit of homework on your part, of how much water is being applied, and the reason that much water is being used compared to what should be used could be, you know, the irrigation system hasn't been tuned up or fixed in 10 years, and it's really time. I mean, there are new products out there that could be utilized, and the payback, and quite frankly, you could take advantage of a lot of rebates that exist in places that are water challenged. I see that as an opportunity. So one is, how well do you know your customer? Do they really have a philosophy and a core value of sustainability is good for us as a company? You can then take advantage of that and say it is something that we're striving to do, and it may actually change the kind of customer you even want to work for over time, is that you start picking those. So I will agree, it's not going to be an easy sell to say pay me more money to help you save a little bit of water, because usually water costs are not enough to offset the increased cost. However, corporate goodwill, and if you can show or demonstrate the power of corporate responsibility and stewardship in the community, it might be a way to look at it besides just water savings.
Very good. And by the way, there are a lot of questions, and we are not going to get to all of them. So if we don't get to your question, Brent's email is up there. I'm going to give you my email address later on in the webinar as well. Get in touch with one of us, and we'll be sure to help you out, but I'm trying to get to as many as possible. This other question refers to the water budgeting examples you gave, such as in Boulder, Brent. And the question really focuses on, does it take into account the establishment of the plant material, or is there an assumption that it's for permanent irrigation? How do those assumptions work in the examples you provided?
Okay, so that is a good question, and sometimes this takes a little negotiating with your water utility. A lot of times if it's a brand new landscape and you go in and they know that it's being installed, you could probably negotiate an extra allowance of water to help with establishment. So to me, it's open communication with the water agency. They're really not in there to make their community brown. They just are in there to want to make sure that they have water resources to meet all the needs, including your customer. And I have found most water agencies more than willing to help and accommodate that. Most of the water budget examples shown here really is for an established landscape that you're ready to maintain. So it's not necessarily the right answer for establishment. One of the arguments that I would present is that while you were not using water while the landscape was being built, ought to be, that extra amount of water that you need to help get it established. And that in the end, it's not going to take any more water. It's just when you've got to use it. And that is one of the advantages of an annual water budget, is that it empowers the water manager to use the water when it's most needed, and he's not being penalized by a billing period and things like that.
Very good. And you use the example of California and their MWELO, and I love, of all the acronyms we use in the office, that's one of my favorites, Brent. But do you know of any other states that use that type of formula as well, or is California really the only state that goes about that formula?
Well, California is the one that kind of created that, and it probably was with their Department of Water Resources, and it was probably a response to a previous drought trying to get that. So the idea of what they're doing has been around for a long time and was incorporated into their ordinance in 2008 and 2009, and then became effective in 2010. So that concept has been around a long time. And what you just find is that there are variations. So with the Irrigation Association, instead of us calling it MWELO, we just call it Landscape Water Allowance, LWA. But almost all calculations are done essentially exactly the same way. I will mention that if you get to the EPA WaterSense water budget tool, they do fix the ET adjustment factor. They've made it at 0.7. And you might argue, and that's for any location, and so it's not very climate sensitive. It's probably plenty good for the east, but it actually allocates way more water than many arid parts of the country have. And so you'll find places like Las Vegas or Phoenix or Tucson who just say, that's way more water than we got available, and we are not going to use that adjustment factor. They have other ways of trying to reduce that, but essentially they're creating a water budget, but sometimes they say you can only have 25% turf or something similar to that, where they know that's the biggest water user in their marketplace.
And here's a kind of a technical question. In practice with these water budgets, do you recommend using a schedule based on the management allowable depletion versus a fixed schedule where run times are adjusted?
Personally, I look at trying to deplete the soil moisture the best as possible, and then figure. So my idea would be my day of irrigation is going to be always changing, but my run time might be about the same. That does not work very well in places that have watering restrictions, where they kind of mandate that you water Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, in which case, if you're really tracking weather and ET, you have to modify your run times every time you're going to irrigate. But the better we can learn to deplete the soil moisture and get it down, that does two things. One is it increases the opportunity for rainfall to be much more effective because there's more space for it to enter. And I think it tends to help plants become a little more hardy and learn to drink from lower down versus always keeping the water or the soil reservoir so topped off that it really, I find plants can be just like me, very lazy if they don't have to work for it. So I think these are some of the things that we're going to learn. One of the best things about irrigation scheduling has to happen in the very beginning, and that is to really make good improvements to the soil appropriate for the type of plantings that you're going to have. And often we do not get paid for doing a really good job of soil preparation, whether it's tilling or adding organics and stuff, and yet it's critical for the life of the landscape that we have that, because water will just get in and get deeper and roots will grow better. But that's a different topic today.
And with that, I think that's a good place to stop. A lot of you submitted questions and comments. We do have record of all of these, but I encourage you to stay in touch with Brent as well as myself. if you have any kind of follow-up you'd like to make. This was the last webinar this year. I hope you all enjoy the holiday season, but on your screen now is a list of all of our future webinars. We start back up in February with an ag focused, and then go into April with our next turf landscape focus, and that will be looking back at the 2004 drought and how California, Texas, and others have addressed their drought conditions through irrigation policy. So we're looking at some of the what we view as best and not so best management practices in dealing with the 2004 drought, and then we'll finish up in December of next year with how policy affects sustainable landscape irrigation. Those will all be listed on that website that I've listed on your screens now. They are not up yet. They will be soon, but I encourage you to check back next week to begin signing up for these webinars. With that, that is my email address. This webinar will be posted on that website, irrigation.org/webinar_series, so you can view it in its entirety. So thank all of you for attending and Brent for presenting. And with that, have a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and a great holiday season. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.